Alright, Common Core Algebra 2, we are starting our first flip lesson with Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is going to be all about linear functions and linear equations. So we're going to do a little bit of graphing, a little bit of solving. We'll see a lot of like slope-intercept type of stuff that you guys have seen in the past. Today we're going to start with some new terms, probably some terms you've heard before but new for us this year. Talking about domain and range, and then the difference between a relation and when that becomes a function, and then how we use the vertical line test to determine if it's a function, and then finally we're going to graph some lines as well. Okay, so new terms, relation is just going to be a set of input and output values. So when we talk about input, we're referring to our x on a graph, and our output we're referring to the y on the graph. So the domain is all the input values, and like we said, that's x. It's also called our independent quantity. The range is going to be our output values, obviously the y then, and the dependent quantity. And then finally, a relation can be any combination of the two, but a function is specific such that every input has exactly one output, so no more, no less. An example would be here. Each one of these inputs in A, so we have 1, 3, 5, and 9, they're all of our inputs. The domain is 1, 3, 5, and 9, and they all what we call map to one specific output. None of these inputs go to two different outputs. Now you'll notice here that both 1 and 3 map to 2. It's okay for one output to have two different inputs as long as our domain only has each one once. And you can see that here we didn't list any of them twice, whereas 2 we could have listed twice. Okay, the vertical line test then is going to be a test that's going to help us determine if something is a function or not, determine if a relation is a function or not. If it passes that through the graph of our function anytime twice, then it is not a function. So you'll see here on this first graph there's 3 dotted lines drawn vertically, and really any dotted line, we can move that line anywhere, it would never pass through this graph more than once, and therefore is a function. So this one is a function, but you'll notice on the second one, any place we can draw really, we draw and we would hit it twice. So we hit the graph in 2 spots, here and here, and so we would say that this is not a function. Now this is still a relation because you'll see all the x's have y values, so every input has an output, but they don't have just one, so it's not a function, but it is a relation. In order to graph an equation in 2 variables, first thing we're going to do, starting early, we're going to construct a table of values, and these are going to be our x and our y values. So in other words, we are creating a list of points. We're going to use our x to find our y. And then once we do that, we're going to plot the points, which we get from our table, to determine the pattern. And once we know the pattern, we are going to connect those points in a line or a curve. So our example for that one here, f of x equals negative 2x plus 1. And what we're going to do then is take an x value and figure out a y value. Okay, one other thing, this is called function notation. So function notation is anytime you just see instead of y, we have f and then in parentheses x, and we read this f of x. So I've got a list of x values here, and I just kind of chose these at random. I kept them small, nice numbers that are easier to work with. In that way, we're going to use these. I'm going to plug in negative 4. So we do negative 2 times negative 4 plus 1, and that's going to give us 9. And then we do negative 2 times negative 2 plus 1, and that would give us 5. And likewise, if we go on down the line, we're going to have all of these points. So really, we have an x and a y value here. So at negative 4, I can plot a point at negative 4, 9. That's 1 point. Negative 2, I'll be at 5. 0, I'm at 1, so that is 1 point up the y-axis. 1, I'm at negative 1. And then 2, I'm all the way down at 3. And you'll notice now, if we decide, and we're going to draw our line, because now we have a pattern here. All of our points are following this pattern, and we have our graph of our function. So this is a graph of a function, and the graph represents all possible points that would make this equation true, meaning any x value I choose, like if I chose right here, what do we got, 5, I could come down and see that my y value would be negative 8, which would mean 5, negative 8 is a point on that line. So if we plugged in 5 up here, we would get out 8. These are our input and outputs. Okay, so big thing from today, domain is your x value. You're going to need that for a long time in math. Domain is range, or domain is x values. That's your input. Range is your y values, that's your output. And then the big thing we did with graphing equations in two variables, we plotted points, or we created a table. And then one last thing, function notation. So when something is a function, we write f of x equals whatever that function can be. All right, we'll see you next time.